In Puerto Rico, the mountains, they don't just go quiet at night. The insects, they don't just chirp, they have a loud, consistent hum. And then the coqui frogs, they'll scream so loud throughout the night that you would almost think that the jungle's alive around you. And back in the 1970s and 80s, there were people in the western hills who believed that something else actually moved through those mountains too at night. It was something human, of course, but just the worst kind. The broken doll laying in the dirt in pieces, that was really the only nice thing that he'd ever given her. And he took that away too. It wasn't enough that he had stolen the remainder of her childhood. Now he had to take the doll away too. The authorities would later say that he beat her over the head with it until it shattered in his hands. And somehow that little detail, that would tell you more about that man than the murders ever could. He had kind of a cruelty mixed with an imitation of affection. It's as if he understood kindness just enough to weaponize it. Diana was 14 years old. Just 14. Sure, it was old enough to have heard the stories and certainly old enough to have known about the warnings, but it was just young enough to believe that terrible things only happened to other people. It was 1988 near Sabana Grande, Puerto Rico. She and her boyfriend Luis, they stood near an old wooded river outside of the town, not too far from a Catholic shrine. It was just one of those places that teenagers go, when they think that they can be alone for a little bit and escape the world. And back then, most of the teenagers around Puerto Rico, they'd heard his name, of course. Their parents would say things like, "We got to lock our doors again, he's out." And people would tell you to look twice if you see a man riding a bicycle down these old roads by the cane fields or through the town at night. You didn't want to be out after dark because they all knew there was a man out there who could escape prison like smoke. There was a man who could vanish into the mountains whenever the police closed in. And they called him, not by his real name, they called him Toño Bicicleta. But essentially, he became the boogeyman of Puerto Rico. Urban legends are supposed to stay stories. That's kind of the agreement we have with them. We invent these monsters so that we can kind of pretend that we understand evil just a little bit and can even control it. And sometimes that's where the danger starts. But on that night in 1988, as they stood waist deep in the mountain river, while the jungle kind of breathed in around them, Diana and her boyfriend, they learned something truly ugly that night. They learned firsthand that sometimes legends aren't just stories. They can become real. The brush moved first. That's kind of how these stories always start. It's not with the screaming, the big event, some music playing. It's just a little bit of movement where there shouldn't be anything. Maybe at first they thought it was a dog or some livestock or just one of those damn pigs that wanders the hills at night, full of all sorts of noises. But then the moonlight, it caught the steel first, and then the gun illuminated, and then shortly after that his face. It was thin, small guy. He was almost unimpressive, which is kind of what made him even worse. Because monsters don't always look like real monsters. They can look ordinary, they can look kind, smile, they can be tired, just like a regular old person. But when he ordered them into the brush to undress, they must have realized at that point just who they were in front of. And somewhere in that moment, whatever innocence that remained that night in that river, it died. Western Puerto Rico in the 1970s and 80s, that was just a perfect place for a man like Tono to disappear. He had these huge coffee plantations, sugarcane fields, and these thick green mountains where the visibility could just disappear all but a couple of feet into the brush. There's places in those mountains where the screams, they just don't travel far. There's places where a body can rot slowly beneath the wet heat, and other places where officers could be looking for a person and walk within just a few feet of them and never know that they're there. And for nearly 3 decades, people believe that Tono Was always somewhere in those hills watching him. His real name was Francisco Antonio Garcia Lopez. He was born in 1943, but Puerto Rico only remembers him by the name of Tono. In 1968, he murdered his lover, Gloria Soto. He lopped her head off with a machete. Then he was arrested, and that should have been the end of the story. He got the life sentence, he got the prison walls. But some people don't go away easy, especially when they still got some fight left in them. Eventually he escaped, and then he'd get caught again, and then he'd escape again. And this would go on and on for years. And every escape made him just a little bit larger, and every manhunt made him just a bit darker. Every newspaper headline only fed into his myth. And after the escapes, authorities would accuse him of more kidnappings, robberies, assaults, and killings of all kinds. When the authorities recaptured him in the 1970s, they sentenced him to 185 years. But that didn't matter because in 1981 he escaped again. And by then, the island started to treat him less as a fugitive and more like folklore. The people claimed he used to use or have lookout points all along these mountains, and he'd have binoculars, and he'd watch for police patrols down below. Others said that the locals would hide him at times. I'm sure some did it out of fear, of course, and the weird thing is that some actually admired him, and some of them hit him because they knew and liked what he was doing to avoid the authorities. And there are other people out there that just have a strange fascination with monsters. That is, so long as the monster doesn't come around their house. And there's another ugly truth about violent men. Sometimes they exude fear in others, and the people start to confuse that fear with charisma. The strange thing about Tono is he was not a frightening looking figure at all. He stood all of 5'1", maybe weighed 120 pounds soaking wet. And apparently he was quite charming too. The papers around Puerto Rico referred to him as some sort of a Don Juan, which would tell you something about evil. It just doesn't always look the part. It can sometimes smile, it can joke, and sometimes it rides quietly down a mountain road on a bicycle while children are still outside playing. And then Olga enters this story of Tono. The strange thing about some people is how often they approach evil thinking that they've got some way of controlling it. They get some sort of excitement out of it, maybe, I don't know. But Olga began writing letters to Tono while he was still in prison. I imagine some of that was out of curiosity, some fascination of some sort, sympathy maybe, or maybe it was just boredom. But one night, curiosity stepped out of the shadows, looking at her, holding a knife. He appeared inside her house after escaping from prison again, and suddenly for Olga, that whole fantasy just disappeared. Because now Tono had become very real indeed. He was standing there looking at her, breathing, sweating. He was standing over her father's bed in the dark. Authorities later said that he was threatening to kill her bedridden father if she didn't come with him. So naturally, of course, she did. She went with him. And then they went into the mountains, into hiding. They'd go through abandoned buildings. For years, she lived beside one of the most hunted men in Puerto Rico. If you can just imagine that existence for a minute. Living inside abandoned structures that the roofs were leaking in from the jungle rain all the time. Sleeping beside a man with a loaded weapon. Never knowing whether every snapping branch you heard outside, whether it was an animal, some passerby, the police, or maybe one of Tono's next victims. When you live beside a man that's capable of sudden violence, a man who's actually already butchered people, it can change you. When the authorities finally raided the hideout in 1984, Tono fled and he left Olga behind. But even that freedom for her didn't mean she was free. The authorities later felt that she had been aiding a fugitive. But of course, it's more complicated than that. And when Tono escaped again, like we all knew he would, people believed he actually came back looking for Olga. Eventually, her family feared that the only way they could protect her was to get her off the island entirely. So there were rumors that they sent her off to the mainland and that Tono may have actually come looking for her over there. If he did go to the mainland, he eventually came back to the island. Whatever the case may be, as the years passed, something inside Tono began getting worse. Or maybe it had always been there, kind of rotting beneath the surface, but in 1987, he actually murdered his stepfather. And then, shortly after that, he murdered his uncle, right around Christmas time. The authorities said he actually attempted to burn one of the bodies afterwards. And there were even reports that his own mother narrowly escaped him. There was no clear motive, there was no grand criminal scheme, it was just hatred and rage, and the desire to inflict suffering. And then there were people that knew him from his childhood, and they described behavior disturbing enough even back then. One man later claimed that Tono used to take puppies and throw them into the air and try to stab them with a machete on the way down. Now, maybe memory sharpened that story over time, or maybe some people were just broken early. But by the late 1980s, Puerto Rico no longer saw him as merely some escaped convict. He was becoming something entirely different. It was a shadow in the hills, a thing that parents feared was still outside every time a dog started barking after midnight. And now we come back to that river, back to Diana and Luis. Diana's boyfriend moved first. Maybe it was out of instinct, maybe it was out of fear, or maybe it was just that dumb courage that young men sometimes have when they think that they can defeat evil if they just move fast enough. But regardless, the gunshot rang out and cracked through the trees so violently that the birds exploded upward from the canopy overhead. And just like that, Luis folded into the water. There's no heroic fight, no dramatic struggle, just a poor teenage boy bleeding out in the river while the jungle swallowed up the sound all around him. There is something truly terrifying about the wilderness. It just absorbs suffering. It doesn't care. Luis died that night, and the river kept on moving, and the coqui frogs, they just kept right on singing. And somewhere nearby, Puerto Rico went to sleep completely unaware that a 14-year-old girl's life had just ended in about every way that mattered. Because Tono didn't kill her that night. He took her, which may have been worse. And then for 8 years, she disappeared with him into the mountains, much like Olga. 8 years. And think about that too. The plantations that they had to run through, the remote structures they lived in, the thick jungle trails they traversed. Authorities said that he would keep her chained up often. Sometimes he'd leave her alone for hours, maybe even a day. And then he'd bring her back some fruit, a doll, something like that, some sort of twisted imitation of a domestic life that they had. And somewhere along the way, though, for Diana, survival started to blend into a weird attachment. Psychology's strange. It's a reality that people don't like talking much about. You see, humans, they have the ability to adapt to terror and suffering, especially in isolation, particularly when one person controls whether you eat, whether you move, or whether you even survive the night. It's no wonder that several of Tono's victims reported developing some form of attachment to him. It sounds impossible to outsiders until you understand just what prolonged suffering can do to the human mind. By the mid-1990s, the authorities were exhausted. The rumors connected Tono to many additional killings, two of which included some police officers in 1994, and that only intensified the hunt. And by then, though, the police officers in Puerto Rico, they were no longer viewing this as an arrest to be made. They viewed this as unfinished business. And on November 29th, 1995, that business came to an abrupt end at a coffee plantation in the mountains. A worker spotted the movement first, and then the men started approaching all around through the plantation rows. Then the shouting started, then the gunfire opened up. The accounts differ on exactly what happened. Of course, the authorities claimed that Tono fired first, but others believe the police officers had long decided that Tono was not leaving that mountain alive. When the gunshots rang out, Tono was struck in the groin during the exchange, and he collapsed screaming into the mud. A woman nearby ran towards him, but the officers shouted at her to stop or she'd be shot too. And then, finally, after decades of manhunts and prison escapes, the killings, the kidnappings, the rumors and the fear, the Boogeyman, the Michael Myers of Puerto Rico lay bleeding between the rows of the coffee plantation. Some accounts claimed officers beat and mocked him as he died in the mud. There's no trial, there's no final escape, no dramatic speech. It was just blood mixing with the wet dirt beneath the gray mountain skies. And then that was the end of the legend that had haunted Puerto Rico for nearly 30 years. But here's the uncomfortable thing about these monsters like Tono. The killing doesn't always kill the story. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Tono became a Puerto Rican media obsession. The radio stations, they would discuss him constantly. The newspapers would always be tracking his sightings. Parents would pull their children indoors early whenever the rumors surfaced that he was out again. His name would return every time livestock vanished and every time a young woman disappeared. And every time a dog barked just too long at the tree line after midnight. And eventually, that's how the man became larger than the truth. He started to appear in songs, movies. It was all in the whispers throughout the island, spreading fear and fascination. And even in death, people reportedly visited the place where he died. Because monsters, they attract attention, and especially those kind of monsters can slip through society's fingers for nearly 3 decades. If you ever drive through the mountains of Puerto Rico at night, you go past the rivers and past the cane fields, and you go past the tree lines that look just a little too thick, a little too dark, you understand something uncomfortable very, very quickly. There are many places on this earth where a man, if they want to, can just simply disappear. There are places where screams, they don't travel far. And places where fear can settle into the ground and it stays there long after the bodies are gone. And sometimes the legend can become worse than the man, because the man eventually dies, but the legend can still live on, walking those hills at night.